The fluorescent lights hum their electric dirge as the night shift begins. Katie Morrison keeps her eyes down, her scrubs wrinkled from the laundry, moving through Sacred Heart Hospital's ICU like a woman trying not to be seen. She has perfected the art of invisibility over 20 years, the soft voice, the apologetic posture, the way she slides past residents as though she occupies less space than the 4 stands she pushes. Her hands shake slightly as she reaches for a patient chart. Just nerves. Just caffeine. Just the weight of a decade of silence pressing down on shoulders that once carried wounded soldiers through Sanjin firefights. The combat boots sit in her gym bag, wrapped in plastic at the bottom of her locker. She hasn't touched them in 3 years, but she can't throw them away either. They are the last physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison existed. That rank, that name, that identity, she buried all of it when she signed the medical discharge papers and walked away from everything that mattered. Sacred Heart runs its night shift with the precision of a military operation, though Katie is the only one here who would recognize the parallel. The ICU charge nurse, a young woman named Derek with bleach tips and a coffee addiction, barely acknowledges Katie as she logs vitals on the 6 o'clock morning rounds. Room 302, 78-year-old male, post-cardiac catheterization. Stable. Room 303, 42-year-old female, pneumonia recovery. Improving. Room 304, the one that makes Katie pause. She doesn't know why, not yet. A Navy SEAL recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained during an operation she wasn't cleared to know about. Lieutenant Chen, 25 years old, lying in a hospital bed in San Diego with his left leg bandaged and his eyes tracking her movements with the focus of a predator assessing terrain. She has seen those eyes before. The shape of them, the color, a particular shade of brown that carries the memory of a place she spent 17 years trying to forget. Katie moves through his vitals check with practiced efficiency. Pulse oximeter on the right index finger. Blood pressure cuff on the left arm. Temperature probe under the tongue. She doesn't meet his gaze, doesn't give him the chance to look too closely at her face. Some recognitions are dangerous. Some connections should stay buried. The wound on his left thigh is healing clean, the infection risk has passed, but she finds herself lingering over the dressing change longer than necessary, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who has done this in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled hospital room. "You're good at that," Chen says. His voice carries the rasp of someone still recovering from sedation. Katie says nothing. She finishes taping the fresh bandage and steps back. No eye contact. No encouragement. No door left open for conversation. The shift change happens at 6 o'clock with the precision of the Navy she used to know. The day crew arrives in waves, residents talking too loud, attending physicians checking their phones, nurses transitioning their patients with clipboards and coffee. The ICU smells like antiseptic and possibility, that particular blend of medicinal tang and fluorescent-lit hope that only exists in hospitals at shift change. Katie finishes her final rounds, preparing to hand off her patients to the day nurses, and that is when she hears the click of Italian leather loafers against linoleum tile. Dr. Sterling has arrived. She doesn't have to look up to know it's him. She can feel the shift in the room's energy, the way the junior nurses straighten their spines and the residents suddenly become conscious of their posture. Dr. Philip Sterling, 52 years old, divorced, financially comfortable, and angry in a way that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with needing to control the people around him. He's been at Sacred Heart for 18 months, long enough to establish himself as brilliant and cruel. The kind of attending physician who makes residents cry in bathrooms and nurses request transfers to different units. The kind of man who sees hierarchy not as a structure for getting work done but as a ladder that allows him to stand on other people's shoulders. Katie keeps her head down as he makes his way to the nurse's station. She's pulling patient charts, compiling them for the handoff, when she hears him start with the new interns. His voice drops into that register he uses for public humiliation, not quite loud enough for everyone to hear, but loud enough. The words don't matter as much as the tone. The contempt. The casual cruelty that sounds like mentorship to people who don't understand what they're listening to. She should have left. Should have gotten her bag, said goodbye to Derek, and walked out to the parking lot where it's still dark and cool and nobody is watching. But she needed to finish the charts. She needed to be thorough. 17 years of habit dies hard. Morrison. Sterling's voice cracks like a whip. Charts. Now. Katie looks up from the nurse's station where she's organizing the day's shift documentation. Sterling stands 6 feet away, his face arranged in an expression of mild disdain, and he deliberately sweeps his arm across the counter. The patient charts, nearly 30 of them, cascade to the linoleum floor like a house of cards collapsing. They scatter across the tile in an explosion of paper, some sliding under desks, others fanning out across the ICU corridor like white leaves after a hurricane. The room goes quiet. Even the ventilators seem to hold their breath. The other residents watch with the fixed attention of people witnessing a power display, and Katie understands what this is. This is day 3 of Sterling's public campaign to drive her out. Yesterday the tray collision in the cafeteria, the coffee that soaked her scrubs, the apology he never gave. The day before, the comment about her nursing credentials being a bit thin within earshot of a potential hire. And today, this. This performance. This demonstration of who matters and who doesn't. Pick those up, sweetheart, Sterling says, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. Try not to lose count. I know math can be challenging for some people. One of the other residents smirks. Someone snorts. The validation Sterling needs, delivered in real time. Katie's hands don't shake. This is perhaps the only lie her body knows how to tell. She sets down the last chart she's holding, and she moves. Not quickly. Not frantically. She moves with the measured pace of someone who understands that panic serves only the person wielding power. She kneels down, the limp in her left leg is slightly more pronounced when she bends, and she ignores the spike of pain that comes from an old injury sustained in a place she's sworn never to mention, and she begins to gather the charts. 1, 2, 3. Her hands find them automatically, sorting them by room number without conscious effort. They know the order. They remember the patients. They remember everything, whether Katie wants them to or not. Her hands have held for lines and tourniquets and the hands of dying people in darkness, and picking up charts off a linoleum floor should be nothing. It is nothing. It is everything. She reaches under a desk for a chart that has slid into the shadow beneath, and she finds one of her tears has come loose. Just one. Just a single tear escaping before her body remembers how to lock everything down. She brushes it away without hesitation, no trembling, no sharp intake of breath, just the acknowledgement of moisture on her cheek and the discipline to continue working. She finishes gathering the charts, taps them into a neat stack, and stands. Sterling is watching her with the focus of someone who has just realized he hasn't broken what he was trying to break. His smile doesn't falter, but his jaw tightens. He's expecting tears. He's expecting apologies. He's expecting the emotional display that would give him the satisfaction of knowing he's won. Katie looks directly at him, and when she speaks, her voice carries the weight of 30 years of experience distilled into 9 words. Your insecurity is showing, doctor. The statement isn't loud. It isn't defensive. It's diagnostic. Clinical. The tone of someone making an observation about a symptom they've seen before, and Sterling's face flushes red because he understands, for just a moment, that he has encountered something in this woman he can't control. That the hierarchy he thought he was establishing has a crack in it. That the mouse isn't behaving like a mouse should. Katie holds the eye contact for 3 seconds, long enough to make a point, not long enough to justify retaliation, and then she turns and walks away. Her gait is steady. Her breathing is even. The charts are organized. The shift handoff will happen on time. And the combat boots will stay in her locker, wrapped in plastic, a secret that belongs only to her. She doesn't see Sterling's mouth open to respond. Doesn't hear the silence that follows her words, the kind of silence that tastes like something has shifted in the room's fundamental structure. She has enough practice at disappearing that she can do it even while walking directly through a crowd of people. Eyes down. Present but not present. Here but not here. The only art form she has truly mastered is the art of being nobody. Room 304. Lieutenant Marcus Chen is awake when she passes, and his eyes track her movement down the corridor. He's trying to remember something. His brow furrows in the way of a man chasing a memory through fog, reaching for something that lives just at the edge of recognition. She moves past without acknowledgement, and whatever fragment of recollection he was grasping dissolves like smoke. The morning light is beginning to filter through the hospital windows, turning the ICU from night shift blue to day shift white. The shift change is nearly complete. Katie will clock out in 7 minutes, drive to her apartment in Pacific Beach, feed the cat she inherited from her husband along with his ashes, and sit in silence for the 3 hours before her body will let her sleep. Tomorrow night she'll come back and do this again. And the night after that. And the night after that, for as long as she can maintain the fiction that she's just a nurse, that she's nobody important, that the woman in the combat boots has been dead for as long as she's pretended to be. But the room went dead silent when she spoke, and somewhere in a Navy SEAL's recovering body, a memory is trying very hard to surface. The morning shift was 2 hours old when Katie reviewed Lieutenant Chen's medication orders and noticed something that made her pause. The morphine dosage Sterling had prescribed the night before, 12 milligrams every 4 hours, was contraindicated for a patient with Chen's creatinine levels. She'd watched his kidney function deteriorate on the overnight labs. She printed the values, gathered her courage like armor, and walked to the nurse's station where Sterling stood reviewing charts with 3 residents gathered around him like he was conducting a seminar on superiority. "Dr. Sterling, I need to clarify the morphine protocol for Lieutenant Chen," Katie said quietly. Her voice carried no tremor. No apology. Just a statement of fact. His renal function is declining. 12 milligrams every 4 hours, that dosage will accumulate in his system. Sterling's eyes narrowed. The shift in his expression happened like a door slamming shut. He didn't look up from his chart. Instead, he tilted his head as if listening to something amusing. "Sweetheart, when you finish your online nursing degree, maybe you'll understand basic pharmacology," he said, loud enough that conversations at the far end of the station ceased. "Until then, I'd appreciate if you stuck to tasks within your actual competence. Taking temperatures. Fluffing pillows. That sort of thing." The 3 residents smiled. Not nervous smiles. Not uncomfortable smiles. The satisfied smiles of people standing on the correct side of a hierarchy that Sterling had just reinforced with surgical precision. Katie felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, pressing against her chest. She took one measured breath and continued. "The dosage exceeds safe limits for his renal clearance," she said. "I can pull the protocol guidelines if you'd like to." "I don't need nursing protocol education from someone without a 4-year degree," Sterling interrupted, still without looking at her. "That will be all." He turned deliberately away. The residents turned with him like a school of fish responding to a current. Katie stood there for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to see her standing. Long enough for the humiliation to register as public fact rather than private rudeness. Then she gathered the lab values and walked back to Chen's room, her hand steady but her jaw tight enough to crack teeth. By evening, Chen's lab work came back. Creatinine elevated. Potassium spiking. The very thing Katie had warned about. Sterling, reviewing the results at the nurse's station, simply shrugged and ordered a single hemodialysis session as if the problem had materialized from nowhere rather than from his own prescription pad. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge that she'd been correct. He simply adjusted the order and moved on to the next patient with the unshakable confidence of someone who'd never experienced professional consequences in his life. Tuesday arrived with the smell of institutional cafeteria food, chicken that tasted like rubber, vegetables steamed into submission, the flat metallic taste of tap water. Katie picked up her lunch tray at 12:16 and carried it to the corner table where she always sat alone, 3 tables away from the residence section. She sat down, opened the lid of her container, and was raising the fork when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Dr. Sterling walked past, carrying his own tray. He walked past her table. He walked closer. And then his foot caught her chair leg in a movement that might have been accidental if his following words hadn't made it clear otherwise. The tray tilted. The container spilled. Chicken and vegetables and brown gravy spread across the table and down onto the floor in a wet, steaming puddle that soaked into her scrubs and splashed across her white shoes. "Oh, clumsy me," Sterling said, not stopping. His voice carried the brightness of someone who'd just cracked a joke. "Are you all right, sweetheart? These floors do get slippery." Two residents at the nearby table started laughing. Not sympathetic laughter. Not even genuinely amused laughter. The cold, calculated laughter of people receiving a message that cruelty was not just permitted but encouraged. Katie knelt down and began gathering the scattered food into the container. A piece of chicken. A carrot. Potatoes in gravy. Her hands moved with the precision they always did, medics' hands, trained for efficiency even in chaos. She didn't let the humiliation break her posture. She didn't let it show in her face. But someone was watching. Lieutenant Chen sat 3 tables over, still in his hospital gown because he'd insisted on leaving his room against medical advice. His food was untouched on his tray. His dark eyes tracked Sterling's movements with the cold intensity of someone calculating a threat assessment. When his gaze shifted to Katie gathering the scattered lunch, something shifted in his expression. Not pity. Not anger. Recognition. The kind of recognition that arrives when a pattern suddenly aligns with something buried deep in memory. He watched her clean up the mess with movements that belonged to someone trained in worse circumstances than spilled gravy. He watched her stand, carry the soiled tray to the trash bin, and return to her table with a fresh one as if this was simply part of her Tuesday routine. That was when Sterling, standing with his residents near the cafeteria exit, made his announcement. "Gentlemen, I'm initiating a wager," he said, his voice bright and conversational. "I'm betting $50 that our friend Katie here doesn't make it through the week. She'll quit by Thursday. Friday at the latest. Any takers?" 2 residents immediately pulled out their wallets. $50 each. Betting on her departure like she was a horse that might not finish a race. Sterling smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd transformed humiliation into entertainment, watching Katie from across the room to see if she'd react. She didn't. She simply sat at her table, opened her replacement lunch, and ate with the same mechanical consistency she always did. But inside her chest, something was calibrating. Some part of her that had been dormant since she traded her uniform for scrubs was beginning to wake up. She recognized the pattern. The public humiliation. The hierarchy enforcement. The pecking order being established through ritual cruelty. It was something she'd seen in her worst moments, not in hospitals, but in forward operating bases in Helmand Province where young officers with fresh rank bars sometimes confused brutality with leadership. Wednesday came with a different kind of tension. Sterling's campaign had accelerated. Every time Katie passed him in a hallway, he found something to correct. Her charting technique was sloppy. Her for-insertion method was below standard. Her communication with patients was too familiar. Each criticism delivered loudly enough for others to hear. Each one designed not to improve her work but to establish that in his presence, she occupied the lowest possible position in the professional hierarchy. By 13:45, 35 minutes before the world was going to explode, Sterling had stationed himself at the nurse's station where Katie had left a small stack of patient charts to be refiled. He picked them up. All of them. And he slammed them down on the counter with a sound like a gunshot that echoed across the station. Paper scattered across the floor like wounded birds. Some fluttered down slowly. Others skidded across the tile in directions that would require crawling to retrieve them. Sterling smiled down at the chaos. "Pick those up, sweetheart," he said. His voice had a quality that made the words a command rather than a request. "Maybe try not to make such a mess next time." The residents gathered again. This was becoming ritual now. 3 days of this, and already the social pecking order had calcified. Katie was the patient. Sterling was the apex predator. The residents were observers learning the rules. She knelt down slowly, not quickly, not in a rush, but with deliberate grace that suggested this was a task she performed with equanimity. She began gathering papers. One escaped her grasp and drifted under a supply cart. Another had slid near the patient monitoring station. She moved methodically, gathering each one, smoothing them out as she collected them. Her movements were efficient, clinical, detached. And then, a single tear escaped. Not a sob. Not visible distress. Just one tear that tracked down her cheek while her hands continued their work without hesitation. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, and in the absolute silence that had fallen across the station, she spoke in a voice that was suddenly very different from the deferential tone she'd been using all week. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor." The words came out flat. Calm. Not angry. Not defensive. Observational. Like a clinical diagnosis. Sterling's face flushed red, genuine anger this time, not the controlled superiority he'd been performing. His hand actually clenched, and for a moment it looked like he might move toward her. That was when Chen spoke. The Navy SEAL was positioned in a wheelchair near the entrance to the patient care area, where he'd wheeled himself despite strict orders to remain on bedrest. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made everyone turn. "That's enough," Chen said. 3 words. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A command delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd given orders in worse circumstances than a hospital hallway. Sterling spun on him, and his mouth was already open with something sharp when Chen continued. "I'm a patient under her care, Doctor. And I'm instructing you to cease this behavior immediately." It was technically outside Chen's authority. A patient couldn't give orders to physicians. But in that moment, authority had nothing to do with rank or title. Chen was sitting in a wheelchair, recovering from blast wounds, and somehow he was the one who'd suddenly seized control of the room. Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. His face was mottled red now, anger and something else, something that looked like fear. "Lieutenant, I suggest you let professionals handle professional matters," Sterling said, his voice tight. Katie continued gathering papers. She could feel the tension in the room like humidity before a storm. She could feel the shift in the dynamic, the moment when Sterling's absolute control had cracked just slightly, and in that crack, something had become visible. The residents were no longer smiling. One of them was actually looking at Sterling with what appeared to be doubt. Chen was still watching Katie, and his expression suggested he was solving a puzzle that had been haunting him for a very long time. Katie finished gathering the papers. She stood up, holding them neatly stacked against her chest. She made eye contact with Sterling for exactly 1 second, long enough to acknowledge his existence without acknowledging his authority. Then she turned and walked back to the records room, her hands completely steady, her breathing controlled, her military training holding her upright like an invisible spine. The disaster was 42 minutes away. The oxygen tank explosion at 2 p.m. hours didn't announce itself with warning. It came as a violent percussion that shook every window in the hospital simultaneously, a detonation so forceful that the East Wing Trauma Bay's entire wall of supply cabinets rattled on their hinges, then collapsed inward with a cascade of metal and shattering glass that echoed through the corridors like a building imploding. The blast wave traveled through the ventilation system, through the stairwells, through the bones of Sacred Heart itself, carrying with it the smell of burning insulation and superheated metal that would linger in the hospital's air for weeks. Katie was restocking the ICU medication cart on the 3rd floor when the tremor rolled through like a seismic wave. Bottles clinked against each other in a discordant rhythm. The fluorescent panels overhead flickered twice, then steadied. She didn't flinch. That was the difference between a nurse and a combat medic. A nurse would have looked up in alarm. A combat medic recognized the sound signature of an explosive detonation and was already moving toward the stairwell before conscious thought caught up. The overhead intercom crackled to life, but there was no calm hospital protocol here. What came through was chaos, voices overlapping, someone screaming that there were multiple traumas in the ER, that they needed all available personnel immediately. The message repeated 3 times before dissolving into static. 90 seconds later, the code blue announcement blared from the trauma bay's overhead system. Then another code blue. Then a third. Katie set down the medication cart without haste. She took one measured breath. Her hands moved as if they belonged to someone else, or rather, to someone she used to be. The gym bag with the combat boots hidden inside had been in her locker since 2004. She'd never planned to use them again. She'd never planned to use any of it again. But muscle memory is its own form of permanence. It lives in the wiring of your nervous system, encoded in the way your hands know to move, the way your lungs know to breathe under pressure, the way your mind knows to compartmentalize fear and convert it into velocity. She was down the stairwell in 20 seconds. The ground floor emergency corridor was already flooding with personnel, nurses pushing crash carts, residents shouting orders that overlapped into incomprehensibility, the distinct smell of ozone from the defibrillators mixing with the sharper tang of bleeding and spilled medications. The trauma bay doors were open. The scene inside was a hierarchy of disasters. 3 patients lay on separate surfaces, beds, stretchers, the floor. 2 were moving, groaning. 1 wasn't. The one on the central trauma table had a 2-inch piece of metal shrapnel protruding from the left side of his chest, and his chest wasn't rising anymore. His mouth was open. His eyes had that peculiar glassiness that meant the brain was already being starved of oxygen. Around him stood Dr. Sterling and 2 residents, all 3 of them frozen in the specific paralysis that comes from knowing a patient is dying and having no immediate idea how to reverse it. This was the moment that defined the difference between institutional authority and actual competence. Katie didn't announce herself. She didn't request permission. She moved into the trauma bay with the purposeful stride of someone who had done this exact thing in a compound in Sanjin with sniper fire passing through walls. Pericardiocentesis kit, she said to the nearest resident without inflection. Now. 18-gauge needle. 1-liter bag normal saline. Cardiac monitor. Move. The resident hesitated for approximately 0.8 seconds, that micro-expression of who is this nurse giving orders, before the authority in her voice overrode protocol. He moved. Katie was already at the patient's side, palpating the chest wall for landmarks, her fingers reading the patient's anatomy the way a musician reads sheet music. The xiphoid process. The 5th intercostal space. The angle of Louis. The human body had very few secrets if you'd learn to read it under fire. Tension pneumothorax. Sterling's voice came from the doorway, a question masquerading as clinical observation. He wasn't moving toward the patient. He was observing. As if observation were the same as participation. Cardiac tamponade, Katie said. She didn't look at him. Blunt thoracic trauma, fluid accumulation in the pericardial sac, heart can't fill. Your patient is exsanguinating into his own chest cavity. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, moving with a precision that belonged to someone who had performed this procedure 7 times before, each time with worse odds and better results. The resident returned with the kit. Katie's fingers found the correct angle, below the xiphoid, angled toward the left shoulder, threading the needle precisely between the ribs where there were no vital organs, only the delicate membrane of the pericardium separating the heart from death. The needle went in. 2 centimeters. 3. 4. Then, a slight resistance as the needle pierced the pericardial sac. Katie attached the syringe and drew back. Immediately, a dark column of blood filled the barrel. Tamponade fluid. The patient's own blood, pooling around his heart, preventing it from beating. She drew back 15 milliliters. 20. The fluid drained into the syringe with a soft wet sound, like rain hitting a torp. It wasn't a perfect solution. This patient still needed an operating room, still needed surgery to repair whatever was bleeding inside, but it was the difference between a flatline and a heartbeat. The monitor above the bed beeped once. Twice. Then the unmistakable rhythm of sinus beat resumed, 140 beats per minute, rapid and dysrhythmic, but the magic word that meant alive, perfusing. The patient's chest expanded slightly as his lungs began pulling oxygen again. Color returned to his face in less than 30 seconds. Katie secured the needle in place with tape from the kit's sterile pack. Her movements were economical, precise, the work of hands that had held lives together in places where the margin between survival and death was measured in seconds. She looked at the monitor, confirmed the trace, and then, only then, stepped back from the patient. Get him to OR. Stat thoracotomy. Somebody page cardiothoracic. He's got an open source bleed somewhere in that chest cavity and you have maybe 20 minutes before the fluid reaccumulates. The residents moved. The senior nurse in the bay moved. But Dr. Sterling remained exactly where he was, framed in the doorway like a portrait of paralysis, his expression that specific mixture of shock and something else, something that looked like watching the foundation of your entire identity collapse. Katie turned and met his eyes. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. No one else in the trauma bay was looking. They were all moving, all doing, all being useful. But Sterling was watching Katie, and Katie was watching Sterling, and in that silent exchange was the entire truth, that medical school and authority and institutional position and the ability to humiliate people in public didn't matter when a human being was dying. That intelligence in the hands mattered. That training under pressure mattered. That the quiet woman everyone had dismissed as just a nurse had just demonstrated surgical competence that the attending physician lacked. It was the moment his power structure fractured. He just didn't know it yet. Katie moved toward the corridor without being dismissed, without requesting permission, because she was already thinking about the next trauma, the next crisis, the next person who might need hands that remembered how to save lives when the world was falling apart. Behind her, she heard Sterling call to one of the residents, something about proper procedure and protocol violations, but his voice had lost its edge. It now carried the faint tremor of someone who understood that the hierarchy he'd built was far more fragile than he'd believed. By 15 hours, Katie was in the ICU tending to 2 overflow patients from the explosion, her hands already moving to the next task, unaware that Sterling was in his office making the first phone call that would set the machinery of retaliation in motion. She had no way of knowing that competence was a threat. She had no way of knowing that survival meant invisibility, and she had just become visible in the most dangerous possible way. By 15:30 hours, 90 minutes after the explosion that had shattered the East Wing and exposed Katie Morrison as something other than invisible, Dr. Sterling moved with the precision of a man who understood that power required maintenance. He sat in his office on the 3rd floor, door closed, phone pressed to his ear like a weapon. The afternoon light slanted through the Venetian blinds, casting bars of shadow across his desk where Katie's personnel file lay open. His fingers traced the employment gap, nearly 20 years of nothing, a void where someone's professional history should have been. Suspicious. Exploitable. Perfect. Dr. Hammond, it's Sterling. I need 5 minutes of your time. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never been refused by a peer. It's about this afternoon's incident. The unauthorized procedure. We need to discuss liability. The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. Patricia Hammond, chief of surgery, listened as Sterling wove competence and concern into a narrative of recklessness, a nurse performing an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician supervision, without following the established protocol hierarchy, without calling a doctor first. It worked, yes, Sterling said, his voice dropping into the register of reasonableness, but that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Success doesn't excuse protocol violation. Next time, someone dies. By the time he hung up, Hammond had committed to reviewing the incident. One domino. Then the second call. Dr. Matheson. Sterling. I'm calling about a staffing concern, Katie Morrison, one of our night shift nurses. His voice was steady, modulated, the sound of a man discussing an objective problem rather than engineered destruction. I've noticed some gaps in her background that concern me. Nearly 2 decades unaccounted for. No medical training during that period, no professional development, no record of employment anywhere. It's unusual. It's concerning. It raises questions about her credibility, her judgment. Matheson, The nursing director made a note. Sterling could hear the pen scratch through the phone line. "I think we need to look into this more carefully," Sterling continued. "For the safety of our patients. For the integrity of the department. I'm formally requesting an investigation into her background and her actions today." 2 dominoes fell. Then the third. The call to Marcus Crane took longer. Crane had been Sterling's roommate at Johns Hopkins Medical School 15 years prior, before diverging into forensic investigation and corporate due diligence. Sterling had kept the connection alive through golf invitations and the occasional dinner where stories were swapped like currency. "Marcus, I need a favor. Professional. I need someone to pull records on a personnel file. Employment gaps. Background anomalies. The kind of thing that might explain a sudden absence from the professional world." He provided the details with surgical precision. Katie Elizabeth Morrison, enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1996, disappeared from the civilian labor market in the late 1990s, re-emerged in San Diego 5 years ago without any explanation for the 2-decade void. "I need to know who she really is," Sterling said, and that was the truth, not the entire truth, but enough of it. Crane agreed to activate his network. The call cost Sterling $800 in consulting fees that he'd expensed through a medical conference account. Worth it. By 1700 hours, the machinery of institutional authority had begun to turn. Katie Morrison was called to the nursing director's office on the 4th floor. She didn't yet understand that the call was coordinated with 3 separate board members, an external investigator, and the legal department's analysis of whether her emergency procedure constituted grounds for immediate suspension. She walked through the hallways where she'd been invisible for 5 years and found herself, suddenly, highly visible, staff members watching her pass, whispers following in her wake. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone above. Someone had already activated the rumor mill, and rumors traveled faster through a hospital than any virus. The director's office was cool, professional, the kind of space designed to facilitate difficult conversations. Susan Chen sat behind her desk with a manila folder open before her, her expression carefully neutral. Beside her sat Patricia Hammond from surgery, her arms crossed, and next to her, Tom Larson from hospital legal, his reading glasses perched on his nose like a judicial accessory. Katie's instincts, those same instincts that had kept her alive in Sanjin firefights, immediately registered the threat geometry, 3 versus 1, documentation prepared in advance, predetermined outcome. She knew this formation. She'd seen it before in debrief rooms and command structures. "Katie, please sit," Susan said, and Katie heard the rehearsed quality of the words, the lack of genuine welcome. She sat in the chair facing the 3 of them, and the power dynamic of the moment was unmistakable. "We're opening a formal investigation into your actions today regarding the emergency procedure you performed. Multiple physicians have raised concerns about protocol violation. Additionally, we've received inquiries about significant gaps in your employment history that require clarification." Susan opened the folder. "You have a right to representation, and I'd recommend you contact your union representative." Katie listened as they outlined the allegations: unauthorized medical intervention, failure to defer to physician authority, suspicious background with nearly 2 decades of unexplained absence. Sterling had framed it perfectly. To anyone reviewing the case without context, it would appear that Katie Morrison had performed an aggressive intervention outside her scope of practice, driven by an ego that didn't align with her credentials. The fact that she'd saved a life was subordinate to the fact that she'd violated the hierarchy. Pending the outcome of this investigation, Susan continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a prepared statement, "You are suspended from duty, effective immediately. Your hospital privileges are suspended. Your badge will be deactivated. We'll contact you within 2 business days regarding next steps." Security arrived 17 minutes later, their presence in the 4th floor hallway drawing attention like a physical gravity. Katie was escorted to her locker, the same grey metal box where she'd stored her personal items for 5 years, and watched as she removed them into a cardboard box. The staff gathered, nurses from the day shift, orderlies, a resident who'd witnessed her save a man's life that afternoon, and watched the humiliation unfold in real time. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone whispered. The public nature of the escort was deliberate, Katie understood. This was about visibility. This was about transformation of narrative, from invisible nurse to suspended employee, from competent to reckless, from nobody to the kind of nobody that hospitals discarded. Katie reached into her gym bag, the one she'd kept in the locker since 2019, and pulled out a single item that mattered. A pair of boots, worn leather the color of dried blood, the soles compressed by thousands of miles of movement through desert and snow and urban terrain. The laces were still tied in a double knot, the way she'd knotted them the last time she'd worn them in 2009. Her hands held them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for reliquaries. These boots had walked through Sanjin in July heat, had kicked indoors, had stood at the edge of landing zone predator waiting for extraction, had belonged to Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison when that person still existed. She tucked them back into her bag without comment. The drive to Pacific View Veterans Cemetery took 45 minutes from Sacred Heart, moving south through San Diego traffic as the evening began its transition from day. The sky turned the color of rust, then copper, then bruised purple. Katie's hands gripped the steering wheel with the same control she'd maintained for 5 hours, the same control she'd maintained for 5 years. She didn't scream. She didn't brake. She drove, and the rain began, not the soft evening rain of Southern California but the hard, angry rain of a system moving in from the Pacific, the kind that hammered windshields and made visibility collapse into gray nothing. The cemetery gates were open. She parked near the east section where the markers aligned in perfect rows, each grave a small squared-off rectangle of memory. She walked in the rain, mud clinging to her shoes, and found the stone without needing to search. Master Chief Petty Officer David Morrison, 1975 to 2018, engraved with the Navy SEAL trident beneath his name and the words "Forever in our hearts." She knelt in the wet grass, and the composure that had held her together for 5 hours fractured like the edge of a tide pool meeting stone. "I tried," she whispered, and her voice cracked in a way her voice hadn't cracked in years. "I tried to disappear like you said. After Sanjin, after I couldn't sleep for 6 months straight, after I watched Martinez bleed out on the stretcher in '06, you told me to get out. You said come home and be alive instead of a ghost. So I did. I walked away from everything, the rank, the medals, the unit, all of it. I cut my hair short and got a job where nobody asked questions, and I let them call me sweetheart like that was an acceptable way to speak to another human being." Her hand shook. The rain fell harder. "I let Sterling make a public spectacle of me, and I took it, because taking it meant nobody would look too closely, nobody would dig into the void where Katie Morrison used to be. But I failed. David, I failed. I got fired for saving a life." She pulled the combat boots from her bag and set them on the wet grass beside the headstone. The leather was darkened by rain. The laces still held their perfect knots, and she traced them with her fingers like they were coordinates on a map back to a version of herself she'd buried. "There was a patient," she continued, her voice steady again, controlled again, the voice of someone used to compartmentalizing trauma into discrete manageable pieces. "A Navy SEAL recovering on the floor. Lieutenant Chen. Something about his eyes, David. I've seen them before but I can't place it, and that terrifies me because I remember everything from over there. I remember every face, every wound, every evacuation route through every village." She sat back on her heels, mud staining her scrubs. "I remember too much and I'm allowed to remember nothing. That's the bargain I made." The rain hammered around her, and she sat alone in the cemetery until closing time, until a groundskeeper gently told her the gates locked at 2000 hours and she needed to leave. She drove to a motel near Ocean Beach, paid cash to a clerk who didn't look at her face, and sat in the dark with the television playing without sound, watching rain streak the windows in patterns that looked like coordinates, like mission briefings, like evidence of a life that had existed before she decided to become nobody. What she didn't know, couldn't know, locked away in a motel room with a pair of worn boots and the weight of 5 years of invisibility, was that by that exact moment, 1900 hours, exactly 5 hours after the explosion, exactly 1 hour after she'd knelt in the rain, 3 black SUVs were surrounding Sacred Heart's main entrance. The motel room door swung open to darkness. Katie Morrison stood silhouetted against the hallway light, her scrubs replaced with civilian clothes, jeans and a grey hoodie soaked through from the rain. Her mascara had run in black streaks down her cheeks. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. She looked like a woman who'd been systematically erased, reduced to the barest minimum of survival, and had finally accepted that erasure was permanent. Then she saw the uniforms. 3 black SUVs idled in the motel parking lot below, their engines ticking in the cool evening air like a countdown. Armed personnel in tactical gear stood at parade rest near the lobby entrance. On the second-floor landing, a man in a navy dress blue uniform stood with his hand on the railing, tall, composed, his face carved from the same granite that made military monuments. Behind him, barely visible in the harsh fluorescent hallway light, stood a younger man in a hospital gown with an 4-pole, his legs still unsteady but his posture rigid as a salute. Katie's breath caught. Just caught. Didn't gasp. Didn't stumble backward. She gripped the doorframe and held herself there, a woman who'd been trained for 17 years to absorb shock without registering it, to process threats in microseconds, to keep her body perfectly still while her mind calculated 17 different trajectories. Senior Chief, the man in the dress blue said quietly. He saluted. The rank hit her like a ballistic round to the chest. Senior Chief. Not Katie. Not nurse. Nom. The title she'd buried 6 years ago, the one that had died with her husband David in a cancer ward at Balboa Naval Medical Center, the one she'd spent every day since trying to forget. Her legs didn't give out. They didn't tremble. But both men moved forward anyway, and she let them steady her against the doorframe because sometimes accepting help is its own form of strength. Marcus, she whispered. The name hung in the hallway like a prayer. The younger SEAL in the hospital gown stepped forward, his four-pole wheels squeaking softly against the motel carpet. His eyes were the same brown they'd been 20 years ago in a village in Helmand Province, but they held 20 years of becoming a warrior. He'd made it. He'd grown up and become exactly what she'd prayed he would become while carrying him 3 miles through Taliban gunfire with his dead mother's scarf tied around his leg. You carried me out of Sanjin when I was 5, Marcus Chen said, his voice thick and breaking. My mother had just been shot. You tied her scarf around my leg and you ran. 3 miles. You never stopped talking to me, never let me look back at her body. You told me stories about a tiger so I wouldn't hear the shots. You kept me alive, Senior Chief. And today I watched you save another life with a pen and your hands, and that voice, that same voice, giving orders like you knew exactly what you were doing because you did. Katie's breath came in short measured increments. Her training kept her upright. Her humanity made her want to collapse. I've been looking for you, Marcus continued. Trying to find a way to repay a debt I knew I could never fully repay. And then I didn't recognize you at first because you were just a nurse, just doing your job, like you weren't extraordinary, like you didn't carry me to safety while bullets. His voice broke. He steadied it. I finally recognized you today when you saved that man. I recognized the hands. The eyes. The person who wouldn't let me die. The man in the dress blues extended his hand. Commander James Reeves, Naval Special Warfare Command. We've been looking for you, Senior Chief Morrison. For 3 years, we've maintained an active flag on your record. When that investigator ran your background check at the hospital this afternoon, the alert went to JSOC at 16:47 hours. We had a mobilization order issued by 17:30. The FBI delivered your full personnel file to Sacred Heart's administration at 1900 hours exactly. Katie's mind processed timelines with the precision that had kept her alive in combat and alive in silence. 1400 hours, the explosion. 1447, the alert. 1730, mobilization. 1900 hours, 5 hours after she'd knelt in the rain at her husband's grave, 5 hours after she'd whispered to his headstone that she'd failed everyone, that she couldn't even be nobody right. Why, Katie asked, and her voice was steady as surgical steel, were you still looking? Reeves's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, respect recognizing respect. Because 23 people are alive because of you, Senior Chief. Because Operation Cyclone saved 47 villagers and military personnel. Because you performed emergency triage under fire at a level that still outperforms our current combat medicine protocols. Because the Navy doesn't leave its people behind. Not when they're wounded. Not when they're hiding. Not ever. We got the alert and we moved, Reeves continued. Chen volunteered to come despite being medically cleared only for light duty. We coordinated with local law enforcement and tracked your credit card to this location. You drove here 40 minutes ago. You've been in this room for 2 hours and 18 minutes without leaving. He paused. We knocked 3 times. You didn't answer. We were about to breach the door. Katie looked at Marcus, then at the combat boots visible through the motel window behind them. They were still in her gym bag, still exactly where she'd hidden them after the explosion, the only physical evidence of who she'd been. The only proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had existed before the anonymity consumed her. My husband, Katie said slowly, told me to disappear. After he got sick, after the diagnosis, he made me promise I'd leave it all behind. He said the war had taken enough from us, that I'd given enough, that I needed to survive by forgetting. He died believing I'd made that choice, that I'd put down the weight and become nobody. She looked at Marcus. But you never forgot. And I couldn't either. Marcus stepped forward and took her hand. His grip was the grip of a man who'd learned strength from loss, who'd carried that strength into adulthood, who'd spent every single mission remembering a nurse who wouldn't let him die. You're not nobody, Senior Chief. You were never nobody. You're the most decorated enlisted medic in naval special warfare history, 2 silver stars, 3 bronze stars with Valor, and a Navy Cross for pulling my entire squad from a burning Humvee in 2004. You're the woman who taught an entire generation of SEALs that the most important weapon in combat medicine is the refusal to accept defeat. Reeves stepped forward and extended his hand again, this time not as a commander but as a representative of 23 families who'd gotten their loved ones back because a woman in scrubs had remembered how to fight. Welcome home, Senior Chief Morrison. The hallway was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that only comes after someone has finally been found after 6 years of being lost. Rain hammered against the motel windows outside, the same rain that had been falling at the cemetery where Katie had knelt and broken, the same rain that had witnessed her surrender to invisibility. But in this fluorescent hallway, surrounded by the people who'd never stopped looking for her, surrounded by the child she'd saved who had become the man who'd searched for her, the rain sounded like applause. Katie Morrison took Reeves's hand. She stood. She straightened her shoulders. She let the rank settle back onto her like a uniform she'd been wearing underneath her skin the entire time. And as the commander and the SEAL lieutenant guided her toward the door, toward the convoy waiting below, toward the future that had never stopped being hers, she felt something shift in her chest, not the breaking that had happened at her husband's grave, but the healing that happens when someone finally admits they've been found. The 3 of them walked toward the stairs. Behind them, the motel room door swung shut with a soft click, leaving only a pair of combat boots and a lifetime of sacrifice in the darkness. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you understand exactly what Katie Morrison felt in that moment. Subscribe to see what happens next when a Navy SEAL finally recognizes the warrior who saved his life, and share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the bravest among us don't need badges or uniforms to make a difference. Like and comment if you believe in second chances and redemption. Thank you for watching.